Welcome, traveller. Take a load off, you look weary. Sit by the fire and let me recount to you the tale of a small boy from Storyosko, Russia, who became the consensus greatest fighter on Earth, but who, like all great fighters, couldn't call it quits when he needed to, and who is, as a result, fighting Rampage Jackson for the Fat Man title this weekend. Where do you even begin with Fedor Emelianenko? The lazy way to do that would be to start right at the beginning, when he was born, talk about his brothers, his mother and father and all that shit. But instead, we're going to do something a little bit festive today. We are going to do the 12 Fedors of Christmas. I have selected 12 phases from Fedor's career, and we're going to have a little chat about them. I've rewatched the fights and refreshed my memory. And if you want to do the same thing, you know, this is a great time of year to do it, because you're going to probably watch him get flatlined on Saturday or whenever it is. So, you know, try and remember how goddamn good he was. What I have chosen to do is represent the portion of his career that nobody really talks about a little bit better than we normally do. So let's get into it. On the first day of Fedor, my true love gave to me Fedor versus Ricardo Arona. Now, Fedor had been in rings since he started out in Rings Russia. Rings Russia, I believe, was the brainchild of Volk Hahn, who ran Russian top team as well, and was one of the main coaches of Fedor and Sergei Haratanov. All the Russian guys who came out around that time, mainly influenced by Volk Hahn. Volk Hahn, known as pretty much a Sambo master. You know, we're giving him a lot more attention nowadays because he was doing things like the Victor roll and the Kanibasami into leg attacks way back in the day. And it sort of fell out of vogue because he would lose to people like Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, you know, very good traditional positional jiu-jitsu guys. And the result was that we all went, well, maybe that leg lock shit doesn't work. And then, you know, you built that onto a more technically sound positional game, like people like Gary Tonin, Gordon Ryan Hall, people like that, and they're all having amazing success in their own right. But from Russian top team, you had people like Haratanov, Fedor, Andrei Kopylov was one of the early ones. Didn't do particularly well, but was a decently skilled old dude. And there was a lot of crossover from professional wrestling because a lot of these guys came from... Volk Hahn became famous as a professional wrestler. I'm not even sure Volk Hahn is actually his name. No, his name's Magomed Khan. It's a complex one. But Volk is Wolf and Hahn is something else. But wouldn't you know it, Volk Hahn was, of course, from Dagestan. And he trained Fedor up at the Russian top team. Fedor was with Red Devil for a while, but I can't remember if that was before or after this. But anyway, he gets Fedor into Rings Russia. Fedor has a couple of fights there. Fedor gets his first fight in Rings proper at Rings Battle Genesis Volume 6 in Tokyo, and that's September 2000. And then this is the thing, like, that's Fedor's third fight, and then he comes up real quick, because his best years are like 2002 to 2006, I think. But he fights Hiroya Takada, and he finishes him with the first punching salvo, does a nice jab, right straight, steps in on the right straight, shifts into a left uppercut, cracks him along the ropes. Takada does a forward roll, it's beautiful to watch, but they decided, we'll have him back, please, he was good fun. And the Rings King of Kings tournament in 2000 took place in December, just before Christmas. And Fedor found himself matched against a young man named Ricardo Arona from Brazil, from Brazilian top team. And Ricardo Arona had just won Abu Dhabi Combat Club in 2000. This was when they were still doing it, well, they did it in 2000 and in 2001, so it was a yearly tournament at that point, but then they switched and it was 2001, 2003, 2005, and so on. But in 2000 he had entered the under 99 kilo bracket and won that. And he was a smothering top player. He was a Brazilian jiu-jitsu guy who could finish a double leg on just about everyone and then hold top position. But he's trained by Mario Sperry and Murilo Bustamante from American Top Team. Training partner of the Nogueiras, of course. And he was a very, very good grappler. But he only just started out in MMA. In fact, he'd taken on old man Kopylov in April of 2000 in his very first fight. And that was at Rings in Tokyo. And then he beat the great Jeremy Horn by split decision in August of that year. So the Rings King of King tournament got some good names in it. Even though it's very early on, you know, Fedor's 3-0, Ricardo Arona's 2-0. The fight takes on considerably more importance than it needs because, 10 years later, virgins on the internet would be going back and arguing over it. kind of like Gleison Tibau versus Khabib Nurmagomedov, we have to pretend there was never a point where this man was beatable or didn't look good. And this is the fight for Fedor. This is where you get to see really all the odd stuff about Fedor's grappling style and fighting style, and it maybe not working out the best, but he gets the decision win. But you do get to see how he's a break with the norm of good grapplers at the time. Right off the bat, Fedor's immediately double-legged, no chance to kickbox the better grappler, and he grabs a hold of his guillotine. And the thing about Fedor's guillotine is that he's got a good, strong guillotine, but he will never jump closed guard. And I think he very rarely uses closed guard at all at this point. And I think this is something to do with the judo lineage. The body scissors is illegal in judo, but you're probably not going to get called on it too much unless you're actually trying to squeeze the guy's ribs in. But with the limited ground time in judo, a lot of guys prefer to keep their legs open and just work that way. If you watch like the old judo techniques being taught, it's always from like an open full guard. A position we don't really even have a name for, because when I see someone get back between the opponent's legs and they're on their knees, I go, oh, closed guard, and then I realise, oh no, his legs are actually open, so it is an open closed guard. But the open guard tends to mean more of a seated guard game nowadays. But Fedor he sits back on this guillotine and he holds it for dear life as Arona hops over into side control, and you have that Von Flue position before the Von Flue was a thing. Jason Von Flue turns up in 2000, is it like 2006-7? And then everyone says, oh, better let go of the guillotine. But back then it was don't hold the guillotine to side control because you won't finish it and they will peel your hand off and start working on a Kimura. Fedor does a little bit of what John Moraga does nowadays, and he holds the guillotine and Arona steps over into mount, and then Fedor bridges and gets all the way back to guard. As a result, but then it's an open guard again and Arona just jumps over. Fedor shows his back, and then after Arona jumps on it and tries to choke him a couple of times, we end up with Arona in the mount. Now, this is where it gets really weird, because even in MMA, the standard go-to from mount is, frame on the hips. Even if you've got the other hand trying to do something, frame on the hips to stop them climbing up and start trying to elbow knee escape, and get back to guard. Or, occasionally you'll see guys upper to try and bridge over. But really that's just to make the opponent move and give you more chance to get your knee and elbow together. And very occasionally you'll see guys go over the top with like legs overhead sort of escapes. But Fedor lays there. In rings there is no punching to the head, which is going to become a big thing in the future matchups of Fedor Emelianenko, because he's the greatest ground and pounder who ever lived, and for most of his career he wasn't allowed to, a good part of his career, he wasn't allowed to punch the head. But Arona is on top of him, and Arona's just skydiving, hips in, smashing him in mount, and looking for Americanas, which, very rarely finished at the high levels nowadays. But what happens is Fedor lets him get the grips on the Americana, then he tries to rip it over to the other side of his head, so he's Americanaing Arona instead, which of course you're never going to submit someone from the bottom of mount with an Americana, but he will then bridge as hard as he can and try to throw him off, and it actually works. He takes Arona from top position to bottom of closed guard with just whipping this Americana reversal over his head. And that's the story of this fight. It's Arona's going to try and double leg him. He's never going to let go of the double leg, no matter how hard Fedor tries to Uchimata him, throw him, shuck him off. And then Fedor's finally going to grab the guillotine, sit down, and he's going to get his guard passed as Arona jumps over it. Each time they end up in side control with Fedor with the guillotine, he tries to bridge and roll over the top, and almost does, and then Arona will scramble and stay on top, in north-south or whatever. Really, one of the things that this hammers home is that, don't ever let anyone tell you that Fedor's not a big man, because he's a small heavyweight, and he's a little bit chubby, but he is big compared to Arona, and Arona was an enormous light heavyweight. Absolutely jacked, too. And Fedor's just muscling him around. One of the other interesting things that it brings out is that a lot of the time Fedor will give up positions that in traditional jiu-jitsu, hierarchy of positions you don't give up. So when he gets flattened in half guard, he just won't hold the half guard. He'll let the other guy mount him, and then he'll start trying to bridge and stiff arm him and stuff like that. Very big on stiff arms into the armpit and stiff arm in the hip when he bridges into people. He gets up from mount a couple of times by bridging into Arona, pushing his hips and then standing up. When Fedor sprawls on Arona and stretches him out, he'll occasionally try to butt drag around to the back, but Arona will sit to his guard, and he'll end up with a bit of a stalemate. One of the strangest things is that the referee keeps standing Arona and Fedor up from Arona in the mount, which again, like, you know, the entire reason that Fedor wins this is because of the specific rules of rings. If it's a fight scored in any traditional sense, we'd probably give it to Arona. But by the end, both are very tired. It's normally a 2-round fight. They have an extra round to work out who's won, and Fedor gets the decision, and Arona is disgusted by this. But it's a very early showing of sort of the peculiarities of Fedor Emelianenko. Which brings us on to the second Fedor of Christmas, which is his fight immediately after, same night, Tsuyoshi Kosaka. Tsuyoshi Kosaka, not the greatest fighter in the world, not even in his prime, really. Does have a win over Volkan, but you know, Volkan was hit and miss because he was a oldish guy and he never really took to striking very well. Mainly you'll know him from losing to Bas Rutten, because everyone that Bas Rutten beat in the UFC became better because we like to think of Bas as really good. But by the time Kosaka fought Fedor, he had 20 wins and 10 losses. You know, he was a fairly hit and miss fighter. But considered a Japanese legend, his best days were in the Lumax Cup, which was back in 1995. So even at this point, he's sort of past it. Luckily, the very first punch that he throws, the elbow cuts Emelianenko, just slides by his head. Very strange to see. You know, doesn't even happen in boxing that much when guys are actually slipping to the elbow side of punches. And this is quickly ruled Fedor's first loss. He's now 4-1. It's a doctor stoppage because of where the cut is. And this was also an arguing point of everyone on the internet for, you know, the years that Fedor was at his best, about how the one loss on his record was bullshit and so on and so on, caused by an illegal strike because strikes with the elbow were illegal in rings. And, you know, the other side of it was that they just needed someone to continue on. And if you've been ruled incapable of fighting, then you can't continue on in a tournament. However, the tournament these two fights were in one night, and then the tournament concluded in February, so there would have been plenty of time to heal. It's kind of bollocks. There would have been plenty of time to do a rematch. So they gave the fight to Tsuyoshi Kosaka, and that's the big smirch on Fedor's record. But then after that, you know, it's been a rocky start for Fedor. The questionable decision over Arona, shitty stoppage loss to Kosaka, and then he begins to put it together in Rings Russia and Rings, and just builds his way up through the organization. As some of the top names like Antonio Rodrigo, Nogueira, Dan Henderson, people like that, start to leave to Pride, which is just coming into its own, Fedor just steps in where they were and starts to take all the tournament prizes. Which brings us to the third Fedor of Christmas against Keri Shull. And this is a great fight to watch if you just want to see Fedor being weird, but also in a really effective way. Right from the get-go, Keri Shull, a huge dude, tries to step in on Fedor. Fedor steps backwards, swinging punches and moving his head. Beautiful backstepping punches. Knocks Shull silly. Shull clinches. Fedor hits a beautiful Sasai Surikomiyashi, which is the step and block the foot sweep. Sends the massive man to his back. And then what you see is sort of vintage Fedor, bad footlock attempts, punching the body as the opponent's there on the floor, and then when they sit up towards you or you can get past their guard, jump on an armbar. And this is really the Sambo and Judo background. You've got a limited time to work, and you're attacking the armbar from the turtle from everywhere. So he's leaping on armbars and crossing his legs in the air, and gets a couple because the rope escape means that Shull can get out of it, by grabbing the rope. But just beautiful stuff. Watching him, it's basically the Hongman Choi fight before the Hongman Choi fight. You want to see him hanging from someone's shoulder, a giant dude's shoulder. It's a really good fight. Short-lived though, takes about a minute, but it's just peak Fedorian rings, really. Just what he did against guys like Lee Hasdell, Ryushi Yanasagawa, Mikhail Apostolov, people like that. The fourth Fedor of Christmas is his fight versus Babalu, which is another one that took on a great deal of significance. Babalu was already established at this time, though. He was a very good fighter. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, very competent. Had fought in the UFC once already, beating Maurice Smith, who was, of course, the heavyweight champion at one point. Had wins over familiar names like Kiyoshi Tamura, Brad Kohler, Lee Hasdell, a lot of the same people that Fedor fought, but had also been down in Brazil doing Vale Tudo events. His only losses had been a majority decision to Dan Henderson, who was already looking like a very big thing. In fact, that fight was part of the 1999 Rings King of Kings tournament, and that was sort of the beginnings of Decision Dan, where he beat Kanehara by majority decision, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira by split decision, and then Babalu by majority decision again in the final. And then Sobral's only other loss had been to Valentin Overeem, who's a very strange character because if you watch him now, you're like, why can't this guy grapple at all? But then he has got loads of leg locks over famous fighters. And the Babalu fight is really best Fedor against a good opponent in his rings days. Babalu was I'd say he's better than most of the guys. In fact, all of the guys that Fedor fought in his rings days, except maybe what Ricardo Arona went on to be, but Babalu was already good. Fedor comes out boxing decently, lands some body shots, enters the clinch, and it's really like, it's obvious that Fedor puts in a lot of his work in the stand-up game later on. But he was very competent on the feet. He's using step-up left kicks to the body, which is what he went to when he was hurt against Fujita, managed to finish him that way. Lovely use of that technique. But, not as light on his feet, not as dancey as he gets later on, but has punching that you need to respect, and that sets up his clinch entries. Babalu looks for a double collar tie at one point, and Fedor immediately swings his way out of it. Just another classic Fedor move. Babalu throws a low kick. Fedor catches it on his thigh, and this is a constant in Fedor's career. He learned to catch kicks and step down the center with punches very early on. He gets sort of gassed in his last round against Arona, and he eats a few good low kicks without being able to counter them. And then from then on, he really gets good at stopping them and making people pay for throwing them, which is of course the most important thing. Catches the kick on his thigh, draws it up, reaches over Babalu's back on the other side, and hits an outside trip on the standing leg. Absolutely beautiful takedown. And then it's into Fedor 101, standing over people in guard, punching down on them. It's very strange to watch because he's always sort of bent in half while standing over the opponent. And obviously, I believe up kicks are illegal in rings, but he's also having to punch the body. He's doing a lot of what Jorge Masvidal was doing against Nate Diaz. Why try and punch the guy in the head, reaching over him, when you can put one foot forward, hold one of his free leg with your backhand, and punch down on his solar plexus with your lead hand. It works really well, even though the emphasis is on hitting the head in the modern MMA game. That target is not something they can take away by moving their head. So Fedor is just standing over him, punching down on the solar plexus, throwing some arse punches in there, catching him in the back of the leg and in the arse. Babalu actually does some really interesting stuff that you don't see a lot of Fedor's opponents doing. He starts entering on leg attacks, reaping the leg. He gets underneath Fedor because he's standing, reaps the lead leg. Fedor sits back, and Babalu ends up coming up in a toe hold. And the toe hold is a real threat to Fedor a couple of times in this fight. You also get to see Fedor just being an absolute beast in the clinch. Babalu gets a great position to hit an outside trip from the clinch on Fedor. Fedor, goes with it, pivots around the foot, shucks Babalu up a little bit so that he's a little bit higher up, and then drops on a double leg takedown while pivoting around the leg that's trapped and being tripped. It's pretty impressive to watch. One of the interesting things is Fedor's reaction to the half guard, because he had trouble with this against Ricardo Arona too, the knee shield half guard. When he gets stuck there, he tends to want to stand up, and sometimes he does that by putting the free leg, the knee on the hip, and standing up that way, which is kind of interesting because nowadays guys desperately try and underhook that leg and pass it over their head or bring it up to their shoulder. Haven't played with that, might have to. But one of the other ones he does is that he laces the leg like he's going to stand up and go for a footlock. And occasionally he does, but despite all his training with Volk Han, he's not good at footlocks, Fedor. Famously tried to Achilles lock Bigfoot Silver, which just didn't work out at all. But he's always looking for Achilles locks, never for heel hooks or anything like that. And it never ever works. But one of the things that happens as a result of him draping his arm around the top knee as he stands up is that guys will bring their feet in to try and kick his chest and get him away, and then he does that little throw by pass and goes into knee on belly and starts punching down. And Fedor, one of the few guys using knee on belly well in MMA because he passes straight into it. A lot of people don't really think of Fedor as a toreador throw by style pass guy. But it was his bread and butter, particularly in Pride once he got there. Throw by and throw the overhand as he passed. But if you watch the fight with Herring, tons of knee on belly, but we'll get into that later. But one of the interesting things is that the leg entries are there quite a lot because Fedor insists on standing over the opponent. Even if he's down in half guard, he'll put the knee he'll put the free knee in their hips or chest and stand up and sort of float over them. And they'll try things and he'll just try and kick his leg free, or he'll fall back and fight his way back up. It's not technically perfect. It's just like he's really scrappy about when he gets knocked off balance, which is a theme in Fedor's career, just having incredible balance and scrambling out of things. In fact, in this one, he tries to jump straight over Babalu's guard into mount. Babalu has both hands under his legs, starts walking out the back door, and Fedor does a hip heist in the air and lands in north-south. Something that he was in the worst, at the massive technical disadvantage in the position, but he still spazzed out and got to north-south. And then later in this fight, Babalu's taking him down. With a trip from the clinch, Fedor falls backwards and somehow ends up in the top of a front headlock. It's like the Ogawa fight, you just watch him and you go, that guy's balance is cat-like. But I do like that the use of the threat of the Achilles lock to set up the throw-by passes. But Babalu is getting in on his legs when he stands up, which is really impressive. And there's a really nice sickle sweep, which is where you catch the opponent's ankle with your near hand, and you put your same side leg through behind their far leg and push them with your opposite leg in the hip. Shit description, but you can watch him do it to Fedor. You can just type in sickle sweep BJJ on YouTube. The fact that he hit it on Fedor is impressive. And then he begins using that same sort of position. He threatens one later and rolls back. He off balances Fedor while he's setting up his hands for a toe hold, which you'll never get while the guy's foot is flat on the floor. But because he threatens to sweep Fedor backwards, Fedor pushes back on top of him and he turns over and starts attacking the toe hold again. The toe hold entries in this fight, there's a couple of them, and they're really nice from Babalu. And the toe hold's a pretty rare finish in MMA. People don't really respect it much. But if you get someone who's good at it and they got good entries, it can be very, very dangerous. Like Michele Nicolini, one of the all-time great women's BJJ competitors, and does very well in MMA. She just beat Angela Lee. Though Angela Lee somehow got a title fight off that loss, and Nicolini didn't. But she has an amazing number of finishes by toe hold, just because she's good at it. She doesn't look at it and go, well, there aren't many submissions completed by this in competition, so clearly it doesn't work. She just goes, okay, what am I going to do to make that toe hold work? And if you look at the stats for the women's divisions in BJJ, she is throwing the average off on high-level submissions. The toe hold is suddenly really popular in whatever division she's competing in. One of the really nice things that you start to see in this fight is Fedor using his legs against his opponent's hands from the top, which you don't There are bits and pieces of it. Randy Couture made famous when in half guard, if the opponent is reaching for your free side wrist, you use the free knee to trap that hand to the floor, and you've got a mounted crucifix, but you're in half guard. So Kevin Lee does that a lot. Chael Sonnen used to do that a lot. Anyone who came down through the Extreme Couture or Team Quest lineage used to do that a lot. Fedor does things like that, but one of the ones he did in this fight is he starts standing up in Babalu's closed guard. Babalu reaches underneath his thigh to start penduluming for an arm bar or swinging over for a knee bar, and Fedor immediately drops back down so that the wrist is pinched between his thigh and calf, behind his knee, and that's a really nice one. You can watch him punch people like Kasaka from there. Can't really do much, you can just punch Babalu in the chest in this one, but if you can hit the head, that's a great little position. Mario Sperry used to catch people's hands there and then pass it under the back for the one-armed man pass. But Fedor wins the fight, and Babalu would famously say later that he grappled with everyone. He grappled with all the nastiest men on the world, and no one was ever as strong as Fedor. Which brings us on to the fifth Fedor of Christmas. 5 gold in rings versus Chris Haseman. This is where Fedor finally wins the Rings 2001 Absolute Class tournament, which I don't know if that's any different to the King of Kings tournament. They had tournaments all the time for some reason. But in that tournament, he beat Ryuichi Yanagisawa, Lee Hasdell, and then in the final, he fought Chris Haseman. Chris Haseman, a good fighter out of Australia. Him and Elvis Sinisic, 2 of the first black belts out of Australia. He was a very competent grappler. He goes after the high crotch, head outside single, whatever you want to call it, early on against Fedor. Very competent grappler. steps in on Fedor right at the start. Fedor does the same backstepping punches because all these heavyweights try and open the fight by running at him. Knocks him down with the first left hook, and a right hand swings just over Haseman's head as he's falling. Fight stopped for a second, 10 count because it's rings, and just more and more weird rules keep popping up as you're watching. But Haseman, really solid grappler, gets in on a head outside single, high crotch, whatever you want to call it, takes Fedor down. Fedor sits up with like the headlock, which you're seeing more guys do nowadays in modern jiu-jitsu. Marcelo Garcia kind of made it popular, and does a full stand-up, but gives his back in the process. Haseman suplexes him, and then Fedor gives up his back and then turns back into side control, just constantly squirming and bumping his hips, not like looking to go one direction down a path, improving his position, just wanting to make space and scramble out. Haseman starts to work on an underhook and goes for an armbar. Fedor hits a beautiful hitchhiker escape, comes up. Haseman goes for another high crotch, gets on Fedor's back again, and Fedor scrambles free. When Haseman shoots again, Fedor slaps on the guillotine. Again, Fedor, very strange guillotine, does it with the arm in, hips in as hard as he can sort of finish it standing, but doesn't really finish it on the ground, doesn't jump guard off it, like sits to his back and then gets past normally. But he's got Haseman warning. Haseman goes to the turtle and Fedor has to stand over him, punching him in the kidneys. But then Fedor ducks, goes down, picks him up by the guillotine and pulls him off his knees. And Haseman backs up and kicks the ropes behind him to get the rope escape. Another rule that exists in rings. So he's now lost 2 points by knockdown and rope escape. Next one he loses, he's lost the fight. Haseman throws a low kick and Fedor immediately counters with the overhand right as he grabs the leg. The Fedor counter, probably one of the earlier examples of it working really well, but you're going to see it constantly. It's something that Igor Vovchanchin used to do too, but it's just a way to stop guys low kicking. And if they do low kick, you've got a free takedown or knockdown. But as he throws the overhand, Haseman falls to the floor, uses a beautiful Y sweep to come and try and attempt a technical stand up into a takedown attempt. Fedor sits down, they end up in like half guard, and Haseman's trying to pull him into deep half guard. Fedor grabs the guillotine, and then Haseman stands up, pops his head out near the ropes, and as soon as his head pops out, Fedor's swinging punches. And this is one that appears in Fedor's book, like the Americana escape from the bottom of Mount, which I read in the book, and I was like, what is that bullshit? What is that? And then I watched the Ricardo Arona fight, and he does it, and you're like, wow, okay, fair enough. But this is one he talks about in his book. He says, like, all the time through his early career, he was looking for guillotines on the feet, and if the head popped out, he was immediately throwing punches because they'd come up without their hands. The sixth Fedor of Christmas is Fedor versus Heath Herring. Herring, not Felice Herring. And this is, like, I picked it because it's a really good example of Fedor adapting to Pride rules. Because Fedor, his first fight in Pride is actually against Semi Schilt in June of 2002. And, it's a good win, but it's sort of overlooked because it's not particularly exciting. It's just grappler versus striker. I mean, the size difference is hilarious because Semi Schilt's 7 feet tall and Fedor is 6 foot. And, not a small man, but a smaller heavyweight out of some of these giants out there. But if you watch that Schilt fight, Fedor's still adapting to hitting on the ground, hitting the head on the ground. And he just looks, there's always this sort of like concern for holding the man down rather than opening up with punches. Which, is the opposite of the Herring fight, because once he fights Herring, he is cracking him and he's he'll pass the guard, punch him in the face. Well, we're talking about Herring now, but he passes the guard, punches the face, and he doesn't mind if Herring pushes him back to guard because he landed his good punch on the pass. The pass was an objective, but the punch in the face was also an objective, and he succeeded in one. Well, he succeeded in both, so he's fine to give up one. It's what I termed back in the day. I termed it dynamic ground and pound, because a lot of guys are so concerned about holding position and hitting from there, not giving up any space or anything. I think once you're confident enough that you know that you can keep passing the guy's guard or keep hitting him, you can pass the guard, hit him from a good position and let him scramble back, because if he's scrambling back, his hands are on your hips, or he's bridging, he's exerting himself, and you're still trying to hit him in the head the whole time. And that's what the fight with Herring is. Herring comes out with a front kick and is immediately thrown on his head. And Fedor just does not relent. He's on top of him, throwing punches the whole time. Throw by passes into overhands. That's when this starts being the Fedor move. Obviously, Dan Henderson, Gegard Mousasi, tons of people had success with it after Fedor. In fact, both those guys against Babalu, and Fedor didn't really do it against Babalu because that was in rings. But yeah, Fedor just hammered Herring, opened up his eye brutally. Gets him out at one point. Herring starts turning towards his belly. And it's interesting because a lot of guys will chase the back. Fedor uses the half Nelson to keep Herring from turning onto his front and hammers him in the head as he's doing it. Again, it's priorities in grappling because, if you've come from a background that prioritizes points in grappling, you're going to go back. Yes, please. That's however many points. And in the jiu-jitsu mindset, the culmination, you move towards the back. That's the top of the positional hierarchy. Whereas if you're a wrestler, or you'll see it with the AKA guys nowadays, they don't take the back with their hooks in unless they're really certain they can finish. Because if you take the back with your hooks in, because Babalu did this to Fedor, you give up the back, they put their hooks in, you fight their hands, and then you can turn in on top of them, and then you're in closed guard, from the worst position in jiu-jitsu to being on top. So Fedor's got a really interesting riding style where he's putting this enormous priority on hitting the dude, but equally he's not worried about losing the position. He's it's kind of like his main priority is staying on top, because he can hit from there, but he doesn't really mind where he is on top. And of course, if you put in your hooks, the guy will roll back onto you, and you end up on your back. He does end up on his back a couple of times against Herring, as Herring sort of survives. Herring plays a lot of turtle. He does a lot of looking to put one foot between the legs and roll for the knee bar. But Fedor does a lot of kneeling on the calf, which is just horrible. It's the standard in jiu-jitsu now. But if you do it and you hit the guy, it's very hard for him to Granby well. And of course, Herring coming into this fight, the idea was to set up a rematch with Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira because they had such a good fight and everyone had sort of raved about how, Quadros said they looked like middleweights out there because they were both technical guys, moving well, striking fast, and then Fedor just put a big dent in that by putting a big dent in Heath Herring's face. The interesting part, of course, is that Herring ended the round on top and the fight was stopped between the rounds by the doctor. So the feeling was Fedor might have been slowing down there. It's just another one of those things. There is, don't get it confused. You can be the best fighter in the world, and Fedor was, but even then, some of these come down to luck of the draw. Luck of the doctor saying, yeah, no, that's the time, or luck of the judges seeing it your way, even when you clearly lost to Ricardo Arona. It's very hard to stay undefeated through a good amount of fights, even if you're the best, without some luck. That's just the way it works. But, as they say, the harder you work, the luckier you get. Watch the Herring fight for the throw-by passes, for the knee on belly. Tons of knee on belly stuff in there. Absolutely beautiful. Hitting well from side control even. He'll turn his hips in. So he's doing... Someone was asking about the scarf hold on the podcast the other week. Turn in with your hips and free one arm to hit. Nice way to do that. Just a good all-around arse-kicking, to be honest. But that was November 2002, and that set up in March of 2003 a fight with Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira for the Pride Heavyweight title. Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira had been around in rings. He was a really successful fighter in rings. He beat Volk Han, had a very close decision with Dan Henderson, because who doesn't? And after winning the 2000 King of Kings title in the tournament where Fedor went out to Tsuyoshi Kosaka, Nogueira jumped ship to Pride, beat Gary Goodridge at Pride 15, for Mark Coleman, Pride 16, and then the Herring fight is when they introduced the Pride Heavyweight Championship. After that, he'd had a good streak of wins. It was Enson Inoue, Sanai Kakuta, Bob Sapp. The Bob Sapp fight, obviously very famous. Semi Schilt, and then Semi Schilt obviously lost to Fedor. And then Dan Henderson, which was basically just a do-over of the 1999 Rings King of Kings final, or semi-final, whatever it was. So he fights Fedor, and the guy is famous for his guard. Against Volk Han, who's half Rodrigo Nogueira's size, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira shoots and then sits to half guard. But Fedor blasts him with a right straight early on, right hand lead, and immediately goes into Nogueira's guard and fights him from there. And what he does extremely well is put his hands on the floor, which is, a no-no in jiu-jitsu, and knows that Nogueira will grab the wrist and probably try and sit up for the Kimura or try and work his knee in for the omoplata. So Fedor, when Nogueira grabs the wrist, he's very good again using the legs against the hands of the opponent in guard. Fedor will straighten his arm, and then underneath Nogueira's leg, he will put his own knee over Nogueira's forearm and rip it free and punch him in the head. Or when Nogueira sits into the Kimura, he will push on the top elbow with his free hand, pull the arm out, rip it out, and then punch Nogueira in the chin, because Nogueira's hands are down by his own hips. And it works really well. Tons of great shots in that fight of Fedor ripping his hand out and punching Nogueira in the face. But Nogueira is close on several occasions. I think he ends the first round and the last round having just swept to top position or attacking a triangle or something like that. There was a lot of Fedor getting caught in triangles and shucking them off before they were properly locked and things like that. It was timing. Timing is a legitimate skill. People work the triangle like you should get the trap, you should work, and every step should be taking away space. But there are moments, especially after you've just shot the triangle, that you can try and shuck it off. And obviously Fedor was just on point here because Nogueira was, making a career out of triangling people and omoplastering them and stuff from the bottom, and Fedor was having none of it. But again, just completely adapted to Pride rules now, because he was using a game in rings that was ground and pound, but it was completely limited by the rule set. It was kind of like, what's the worst way you could fight in rings? And Fedor fought that way. But now he's in Pride. If it was like training wheels, you take the training wheels off and suddenly he's like 5 times more dangerous. And he hadn't abandoned hitting the body either. If Nogueira was working on a Kimura and he couldn't just rip out in the first go, he'd be there punching Nogueira in the kidney with his free hand. But a tremendous fight, and there's the famous shot of the Japanese commentator woman crying because she'd been sort of seeing Nogueira on the side at the time. And, Nogueira it takes a pasting, loses the decision. But, he has his moments, and that's the thing with Nogueira. He was never stopped, until very late in his career. Pretty much after his career was done, we all thought, hang it up, and then he was getting stopped. But through most of his career, it was Nogueira never loses, he just runs out of time. And that really links in with the second Nogueira fight, which is a little way off. Fedor takes 6 or 7 fights between the first and the second. This fight is March 2003. Second fight is August 2004, and it's actually in the Pride Openweight Grand Prix. But the second fight, Nogueira is using very similar attacks to the first, but he's using a lot more knees on the biceps, which is a style of open guard. It's like a short spider guard. It's the kind of spider guard that you can actually play no-gi. It's the position that Eddie Alvarez swept Edward Foliang from, and Pablo Popovich swept Marcelo Garcia from in one of their matches. But by using that, Nogueira was able to sit up and look for arm drags, and also in the first fight he'd been able to sit up and sweep Emelianenko with like his famous half guard sort of pendulum sweep, the one he did to Tim Sylvia. You get one leg, you get one arm, you're in half guard, you turn him onto their side. And he'd done that to Fedor in the first round of their fight, or the second round, I can't remember. But in the second fight, he comes out and he pursues that exclusively. He's not interested in the omoplata, the Kimura, the stuff where Fedor was just tearing his hand out. He's instead putting his knees in front of Fedor's chest and biceps so he can't hit him. And he's looking for legs, sweeps, arm drags. And he almost catches Fedor about 4 times before the headbutt. In fact, the headbutt happens off an arm drag. Fedor dives forward trying to throw his arm over the top of Nogueira's head. They clash heads and it opens a massive cut on Fedor, and Nogueira's furious about it because, rightly so, Fedor was in trouble. It was like Fedor well, I'm sure that Nogueira thought he was trying to butt him deliberately, but what was actually probably happening was that Fedor was spazzing because he was losing position, and a lot of Fedor's game is spaz when you're losing position, but he was in real dire straits at several points in that fight, and Nogueira was probably right to feel that he'd been gypped out of a winning performance. But that brings us on to the 8th Fedor of Christmas, Fedor versus Nogueira III. Now this happens immediately after. The cut opens in August 2004. December 2004, the rematch is booked for Fedor Nogueira III. It's 1-0 and 1 no contest. And it was so hyped at the time. I can remember this because it was such a letdown, the ending of the final conflict fight. They had Takada come out and say, sorry, we can't do the rest of the fight, because as you can see, maybe they could have lied, but they'd shown on camera on the big screen the doctor pull Fedor's cut apart and you could see into his skull. So they gave him time to heal up, and in December 2004, Fedor Emelianenko puts on one of the best performances of his career, one of the ones that is the most highlightable. You can make highlights of this fight for days because he specifically focused on an area of the fight where he was much superior to Nogueira, which was the boxing and the takedowns, and then he didn't really do much when he was on top. He still went into the guard and but it was a conservative performance from the guard. He wasn't there going, I'm going to give you this, I'm going to take it away and I'm going to hit you. He was almost counter-punching from Nogueira's guard in the first and second fights. In this fight, he's throwing Nogueira to the mat, trying to jump over his guard and stomp him in the head before he can do anything, and then going, nah, come on, I've missed this, get back up to the feet. And it's absolutely beautiful. The study in punch and clutch, I would say, because Fedor doesn't, knee to the floor takedown. He doesn't do like big wrestling shots. He does, what he calls a marottigari, double-handed reap, but it's punch, weave in, just under the armpit, look up into the opponent, drive them across, take their legs out, and he just fling Nogueira to the floor. And yes, part of that is him being enormously strong, but a lot of it was the entries. They were beautiful. By throwing punches hard, you give the opponent no choice. They have to do something about it, and when they got their hands up or they're trying to slip, you're in on their hips and in perfect position to run through. It is Fedor Emelianenko at his absolute best. I did a huge piece on it of Fightland once, and it's elements of fighting that some of it you won't see again because it's stomps and soccer kicks, joined in with all this other stuff. Some of it you are just seeing very good guys doing now, right hands into clinches. Volkanovski did that to Darren Elkins loads. Gunnar Nelson, that's his one move, and it's worked so well for him so far. But it's just beautiful mixed martial arts, and there's a moment in it where I think it's like the second or third takedown. Fedor shoots a right hand lead, weaves in, the right hand lead slaps Nogueira over the head as he steps in. He weaves into the takedown, and then he tries to kick him in the head as he's on the floor. And I was like, that is the perfect, if you had to teach one perfect for the street combination, it's overhand right or right hand lead, weave in, marottigari, double leg throw by or whatever. You don't go down with them, and then try and kick them in the head while they're on the floor. That's perfect street fight ender, starter and ender. It's what Jeff Thompson used to call 3-second fighting or whatever it was. The 9th Fedor of Christmas is one that I think you have to touch on because it's such a divisive point, and that's Fedor versus Cans, or Fedor specifically versus No-Hopers. And don't even pretend that there weren't any, because there are people who are like, teach of the junk, but the streak. Zuluzinho was on an 8-fight winning streak. Like, no, there are people Fedor should have been fighting, and there are people that Fedor shouldn't have been fighting. Gary Goodridge, at that point, was not someone that Fedor should have been fighting. Kazuyuki Fujita, even, as well as he did, probably not someone he should have been fighting. Yuji Nagata, did he even have a fight at that point? Oh, he'd had one where he got head kicked by Cro Cop 2 years earlier on New Year's Eve, and then he came back on New Year's Eve 2003 to get knocked out by Fedor. These are fights that shouldn't really be happening. It's a waste of Fedor's time. It's a waste of someone else's health. Zuluzinho is another one. And, if we extend it to, like, no-hopers, the fight against Matt Lindland was one that didn't really make much sense. And, one of the main criticisms of Fedor is that, actually, even Mark Hunt was not supposed to be a big test, but he was because of the theme we're going to get into of Fedor sort of focusing on his hands and falling in love with boxing. Hongman Choi, and then later on, like, Singjai Deep, Pedro Hizo, ancient Pedro Hizo, Chael Sonnen for some reason, Fabio Maldonado, and he even lost that one. But it has been a theme in Fedor's career. And the other one is that, like, for as long as Fedor was the best in the world, consensus, he only defended his title 3 times, or he's only defended the Pride title 3 times, over about 3 or 4 years. He defended against Rodrigo Nogueira, Mirko Cro Cop, Mark Hunt. I mean, the Mark Hunt one's weird, but, Cro Cop and Nogueira deserved the title shots. But, it's weird, because, a lot of his fights were in tournaments and things. Some of them were just tune-ups versus bums. But you don't... It's kind of like what happened to Kyoji Horiguchi, where he fought Kai Asakura, and if you're fighting the guy and he's at your weight, the belt should be on the line. The guy shouldn't have to beat you twice to get it. It's not like, oh, you beat the champ, now you deserve a shot at his title, because any sensible person goes, yeah, he's the champ now. The other really notable one is Tsuyoshi Kosaka, because Tsuyoshi Kosaka wasn't great when Fedor met him the first time, and obviously the win was bullshit and you want to get it back. They did sort of sell it as like a grudge match. But since he fought Fedor, he'd gone 4-5. The wins were over people who don't even matter. It wasn't convincing anyone really, and Fedor just beat the snot out of him. And I mean, it was a perfect like Fedor in Pride showing, because he just hammer fists, punches to the face, throw by passes, stomps, soccer kicks, just brutalized him. And, you got to see the TK guard. And ironically, the TK guard is something that Fedor did too, because they're both judoka. They don't really close their guard. They'll play the guard with their feet down by the opponent's, next to the opponent's knees, or on the back of their hand, or on the back of their calves. And if you do it on the back of the calves, it can actually be really annoying, because you can stop the guy standing up. But, ultimately, again, a fight that didn't need to happen. Running up the numbers, making the champ look good, And do you need to make the champ look good 3 times for every time he defends the belt? You don't really need to. But that brings us on to the 10th Fedor of Christmas. Probably Fedor's finest hour. I think, it's this or Nogueira, the Cro Cop fight, which they were trying to put together for ages. But, Fedor kept breaking his hand on cans, broke his thumb smacking the shit out of Gary Goodridge in a performance where he met no resistance. Cro Cop obviously had the loss to Kevin Randleman, which sort of derailed things a bit. But then they finally brought it together. And, Fedor had been working with Ernesto Hoost in Holland, one of the great kickboxers of all time. And he'd really just sharpened everything up wonderfully. His hands were looking fabulous. Against Nogueira, they were looking good, but they just got better and better. And, he walked down a very, very scary kickboxer. Hoost had fought Cro Cop 3 times in kickboxing. So he knew he was dangerous. But for a Russian Sambo and judoka to come in and fight the best striker in MMA on the feet. And, Cro Cop, specifically in MMA, I think even if you taught Ernesto Hoost or someone like that to wrestle, I think they'd have really struggled. We always say this with, like, Andy Hook, if he came to MMA. A lot of his techniques are just, he would fall over a lot in his fights because he was throwing axe kicks and shit, But you got Cro Cop, who is like the one-shot body and head kick master, one-shot counters as he steps off to the side. That's pretty much a perfect style to make knockouts happen in MMA without opening up much. But obviously the Fedor Emelianenko plan was get him on the back foot, move him backwards. Not only will you make it harder for him to kick effectively because he has to stop and get on one leg, but you're also going to tire him out by doing that. And eventually, if he hits the ropes and we end up clinching, I as Fedor am as an advantage because that's where I'm going to use my judo. But also working the body shots. There were some lovely step-up kicks, body kicks as Cro Cop was circling. This is the thing we always say about like Donald Strain and people like that. It is not, when you say kick with the kicker, it's not like you're going to trade kicks. If you put him in a position where you can kick and he's not going to be able to kick as effectively, like if he's on the back foot or against the fence or against the ropes, and you can kick to cut him off, it doesn't matter that his kicks are much better than yours. Your stumpy, shitty kicks will do their job, and he won't be able to throw his nice kicks. However, of course, like, it's easy to make that game plan sound like genius and, the easiest thing in the world to do, but people had tried it before. It's number one thing you do against a strong kicker, keep him on the back foot. Problem was, if you did that, you were walking onto Cro Cop's left hand, and he had the sharpest left straight. He did a nice side step and throw it over the open side, and he also just did it straight as a piston. You gave him options if you moved in on him. And Fedor does get wobbled by a short left straight as he's coming in round 1, and ends up backing up. Cro Cop almost kicks his head off, and then they fall through the ropes. It's very risky business, and you're reminded, this is the line that Fedor's walking. And the other thing was that Fedor, he was really going belt and braces with his style. He was checking kicks, and there's some really good footage out there of him teaching how to check kicks and block kicks. Because obviously, against Cro Cop, you want to keep him on the back foot so he can't kick, but you're still going to have to deal with the kicks at some point. And Fedor really does like the long barrier, or whatever you want to call it, where you bring up the knee. Even if they're kicking body and head, you're bringing up the leg to check. Guys only check in MMA if it's like a low kick, but he's really belt and braces with it, bringing up the leg to check. It has his same side arm angled so that if the kick hits the arm, it'll glide over the head. And the other thing that he was really cautious about was that he would even like be able to parry punches while on one leg like that. You can watch him, like he goes to check some of Cro Cop's like hip feints, and then realizes Cro Cop's punching, and he'll either slip it on one leg or parry it on one leg, which is very hard to do. And the reason that he could do it was because he was working with Ernesto Hoost and sparring with fucking Tyron Spong. So, not a shortage for guys who are going to punch you in the head and kick you a lot. The body shots are absolutely beautiful in the fight. I would have loved more, because anytime I see he throws some body punches and then he gets away from it for a bit because he's trying to keep the pressure on and not give away free counters and so on. The throws and trips are lovely in it because obviously Cro Cop have been working specifically on stopping the throws and trips, and Fedor will hit throw an uchimata just enough to get Cro Cop throwing his legs out and basing, and then he'll come back and uppercut him in the face. Just beautiful performance all around. I mean, Cro Cop nearly triangles him at one point, and you're starting to see, like, I think Fedor, because he's the best fighter ever or one of, and was known for being well-rounded, you have to remember that guys' abilities are in flux all the time. If you're not working something 100% of the time, you're not going to have it at the same level. When Fedor was like all grappling with some, he was at Russian top team and they were a grappling team basically. I imagine that they did some sparring and they got the mitts out and stuff, but they weren't Ernesto Hoost's gym in the Netherlands. The more you try and improve yourself, the more you're going to suffer in other areas. And I think the fact that even Fedor does that is really good evidence that it's incredibly hard to keep improving in all areas all the time. Which brings us on to the 11th Fedor of Christmas, which is the Fedor versus Sylvia. And this is an interesting fight for me because I and others, it's not just me, but like you could see Fedor moving towards this sort of like stand and bang style. And they were really helping with how they were advertising him. They were billing him as this amazing knockout artist, but he had he had 30-something fights and something like 6 knockouts. He was not knocking people out. The thing was that his hands were dangerous, and so people respected them, and then he was able to move into the top position and get his work going from there. He would hurt people and then finish them with submissions and so on, but knockout artist he was not, but he was being billed as one, and he seemed to believe it. And the Sylvia fight is great because, the UFC let Sylvia go off the back of, I believe it was the loss to Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. He had looked really good against Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. He had jabbed his face off, but Rodrigo Nogueira did that magic where he absorbs all your punishment and then somehow gets underneath you, sweeps you, and submits you. Again, with the same sweep that he used on Fedor in the first and second fights. So the UFC had publicly announced that they were letting Sylvia go, even though he had more time on his contract. And it was a clever move by the UFC because, one, he was not worth a lot. People didn't enjoy watching him fight. He was booed everywhere he went. That's what Matt Serra said about the George St. Pierre fight. He said, I don't mind fighting in front of a hostile crowd. I'll just feel like Tim Sylvia when he goes anywhere. But of course, if you're in a prolonged public spat with Fedor Emelianenko as the UFC trying to get him to come over and fight. And he was hanging out with Vadim Finkelstein, who's a creepy dude to begin with at this point. He was part of M1, he had an ownership stake in it or something. But if you can take away the undefeated record, I say undefeated, he's got the loss to TK, but we all respect it as an undefeated record. If you put a dent in that, it'll give you some leverage to talk him down on his ridiculous fee, because I'm up for fighters getting paid more, but Fedor has always been paid very, very well compared to the average fighter, or certainly since he became like the best in the world. I'm fairly sure Scott Coker's still paying him $2 million to just get beat up. But there was a lot on the line for Fedor because he hadn't fought a great fighter since Mirko Cro Cop. He'd been arsing around with fights against Zuluzinho, Mark Coleman, almost losing to Mark Hunt, fighting Matt Lindland, who's a middleweight, Hongman Choi, who, despite being gigantic, not a good MMA fighter. So, he hadn't really done anything since 2005. This is 2008. Affliction had set up their own event for it and called it Affliction Banned because setting up their own promotion and hiring Fedor meant that they were banned from appearing at UFC events. And then Fedor came out and did him in 36 seconds. And it was the same that he did to Zuluzinho. Right hand trap, slap down the jab, move in fast, head on to where the jab would have been, and left hook around the side. And the left hook always sneaks over that glove because there's not a lot you can actually do with your right glove to stop a left hook in MMA. You don't have much coverage. Hits him square in the neck. Sylvia reaches for the double collar tie. Fedor starts swinging over the top, shucking off the hands and backstep punches too. Knocks Sylvia down, jumps on his back, rear naked choke. And Fedor really didn't go to the rear naked choke much. He was really more of an armbar guy. When he did do rear naked chokes, it was like with an S grip, and it would just be blade of the forearm across the throat, and he just went ape shit trying to pull your head off. But it's an important moment because not only is it Fedor proving that he's still one of perhaps the best in the world ever, because Tim Sylvia just fought for the UFC title and gone 3 hard rounds or whatever it was with Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira for it, and Fedor just beat him in 36 seconds. But this also marks sort of like the last of the best of Fedor for me. In fact, I think the best of Fedor is Mirko Cro Cop, because he trains up his striking so hard for that fight. He left Volkan a long time ago, and there are people who who speculate leaving Volkan is part of what caused the atrophication in his grappling skills. Which, if you use Sergei Haritonov as another example, good proof. He went to Golden Glory to learn to kickbox, forgot how to grapple. But for a while, Fedor had just been sort of swinging wild. And this fight was Fedor. I mean, he was doing what he does, but it was just sort of throwing his hands. And then his next fight was against Andrei Arlovski, and it was the same sort of thing. I mean, there was a lot of Arlovski was lighting him up. A lot of those shots Fedor takes on his shoulders or slips and so on, but he wasn't looking good. He was just looking weird. He didn't ever try and take Arlovski down or use any of his clinch magic or do any of the things that, if you saw Fedor from the Rodrigo Nogueira fight against Andrei Arlovski, that'd be interesting. Lands the knockout punch because Andrei Arlovski not only telegraphed the flying knee, but he telegraphed it in the 2 fights before that. So it was something that they all knew was coming. And that brings us to the 12th Fedor of Christmas, and that's where I'm going to cut my story short, because I don't need to do all the... I think you've had the best of Fedor. The 12th Fedor of Christmas is Brett Rogers, and that was a fight where he really was just swinging wild. He used a couple of overhands into takedowns and so on, the sort of like throw him away takedown. But Brett Rogers, he was dangerous, but he wasn't good. And you really got to see just how little Fedor was doing that resembled his old self. Obviously, after that, he fought Fabricio Verdum, jumped into his guard, got triangled, and then the Bigfoot Silva fight was really sad because you got to see part of what made Fedor so amazing, his incredible balance and stuff like that. Antonio Bigfoot Silva is twice the size of Fedor, and he had his hands locked in a double leg along the fence at several points in that fight. He picks Fedor up, and Fedor's just like, nah, I'm not going. Which is as good as magic, to be honest, with that kind of size difference. When Bigfoot does get Fedor down, it's by time, the opening of the second round, Fedor comes out, throws the right hand overhand, as he always does at the start of every round ever, and every engagement at this point, and Antonio Silva just times it, hits his hips at the right time, and easily gets the takedown. You got to see just how special Fedor is, but also just how not special he is, in terms of, if you do the same thing over and over again, the guy will time you, even if he's Bigfoot Silva. And that, that's where I want to end our story, because you could do the 5-fight comeback, the streak, as Teep always calls it, which is 2011, 2011, 2012, break of 3 years, 2015, lose in 2016 but get the decision anyway, and that's a 5-fight hot streak. It gets kind of sad after then. I mean, we got our feel-good moments with Frank Mir versus and Chael Sonnen. If he beats Rampage this weekend, good on him. But he could do that by wrestling with Rampage, and then Rampage would do his usual thing where he complains about people wrestling in mixed martial arts. But he's probably going to come out swinging, and, he can't take the shots anymore. So look forward to that. But I think it's important to understand where Fedor came from, what made him so special, when it all started to change, really, because, from leaving Russian top team, he starts to become a better striker. Then you get a real obvious drop-off where he's not really grappling by choice anymore, and people like Mark Hunt are holding him down and almost Americanering him. Then you got him swinging wild at Sylvia, Arlovski, Rogers. It costs him against Verdum, Bigfoot, and Henderson. Then he goes a little bit more technical, but he's fighting old men in Monson, Ishii. Well, no, Ishii wasn't an old man, but he's getting a bit more technical again against Ishii, Hizzo, Monson. I think that would have been a great time to just call it. Well, it was a great time to call it quits after that Hizzo knockout, because Hizzo was done. Hizzo was so done. There are levels to washed up in this, and Hizzo was considerably more washed up than Fedor. But they got him back in December 2015 to help Ryzen sell a show against Singh Jaideep, which was obviously just a gimme. But when you're losing, well, not losing, but when you're going life and death with Fabio Maldonado, who wasn't even very good as a middleweight, I think you need to rethink what you're doing. But that's our story for today. That's Fedor Emelianenko, one of the greatest fighters of all time. And like any fighter, not as special as he was. He wasn't really special because he still came back too long, still couldn't hang it up when he wanted to. He was incredible. He managed to negotiate himself incredible paydays, but it still was never enough. It really is just a high. People seek that high over and over again, even at the cost of their own health. But have a marvellous Christmas. I will see you soon for the next episode of the Fights Gone By podcast, and we'll do another Filthy Casuals guide at some point. If you want to support the podcast and get extra stuff, sign up to the Patreon. If you want to send an email to the podcast, fightsgonebypodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing at any time, fightprimer.com. I'm your boy Jack Slack. Fedor bless.